I want to thank all of you for coming out today, and to our panel for coming and joining us. As we near the end of the year and as we head into the holidays, I thought it was important to sit down with the community and just show you what we've been able to accomplish in the last 2 years in my first term. I was just re-elected a couple of weeks ago, and thank you for your support. And wanted to take the time to just talk a bit about what I've been working on. As a lot of you know, I like to do town halls. We've been doing a town hall at least once a month, sometimes more. We had a town hall on homelessness at Ascensia last Monday. We had a town hall a few weeks before that. And we're trying out different formats. So tonight is going to be a little bit of a new format for us. I hope you enjoy it. I do want to, before we begin, acknowledge just a few people. And I don't know if we want to bring the lights up a little bit or leave it like this. What do you all think? Lights up? Leave it? Bring the lights up a little? Yeah. Well, first we have two members of the Burbank City Council here with us tonight. I'd like to acknowledge them. Council Member Sharon Springer and Council Member Bob Fructose are here. Thank you for coming. Oh, there we go. Now I can see. And I'm sorry if I miss anybody or don't see anybody. Is that Tim Murphy? Our other council member is here. He's shaking his head, but he is here, so thank you for coming. Also, I want to introduce my staff. You all met Sarojini, and also with us, and if you can either stand or raise your hand, is Seamus, who is one of my field reps, Blake, who is another field rep, Victoria coming down the row, and Maria, who is here somewhere. And then from my legislative director, Jim Metropolis, flew in today from Sacramento to be with us here, in case anyone had any tough questions. He is the man who's responsible for working on these bills throughout the year, so I wanted to make sure that he was here so that you all could see who's responsible for every day helping to write legislation, work with the advocates, meet with all the stakeholders, and be there through all of that process. So thanks, Jim. So the way that we're going to do this tonight is I'm going to give you a brief overview, and I'm not going to talk about all of our bills because we did a lot of bills, way too many bills. And it was a lot of work, but I'm proud of all of them. So we do have a full list of the legislation that we worked on this year that we passed, as well as legislation that we co-authored, even if it was vetoed or that we introduced. So I'm going to briefly go over that. And then I've got a really great panel of folks who are going to talk about some of the major legislation and explain what it means to their agencies or their groups that they represent, so that you can get a sense, not just from me, but what it means to some of the people who actually have to work with the legislation here in the district. And then after that, we'll have 15 or 20 minutes of a dialogue, of a Q&A. And I do have staff here to answer any questions that you might have to them. And hopefully you can give me some direction as we go into next year that I can take back to Sacramento. And as many of you know, I try to be very accessible and around, so you're of course also always welcome to reach out to my staff or to reach out to me personally if you have ideas for legislation, or if you want to just weigh in on any topic or anything that's happening in the district. We want to know what you're thinking. So moving to what we've done in the past 2 years. One of the accomplishments that I'm most proud of started back when I was in City Council in Glendale, as the city went into its Riverwalk project. And for those of you who aren't that familiar, Glendale worked on a pedestrian and bicycle bridge on their side of the LA River. And it goes from the Burbank border in the Rancho all the way around right under the 134 by Grayson Power Plant. And it's a really nice trail that's a couple miles long. There's an equestrian portion at the top with a public arena, and then you have the bicycle and pedestrian path. But the plan was always to have that be a safe way for people to then take a pedestrian and bicycle bridge across the LA River to the Glendale Narrows part of Griffith Park, where the soccer fields are and the dog park, and then of course you can just go across the bridge to the zoo and the archery and get into the park. And it was always that part that was difficult for the city to figure out how to fund, because the bridge is at least $20 million. Well, guess what? In my first year in the legislature, I was able to secure the $20 million for the bridge. And so that bridge is going to be a reality, and the city will now move forward with their EIR program. I was also able to secure $500,000 in funding for the Braille Institute, which is the main source of reading materials and help for people that are sight impaired in the Los Angeles region. So that was really important for those folks in helping get them the tools that they need to lead the lives that give them the quality of life that they deserve. Thank you. And moving on to bills. In just the 2017-2018 legislative session, that's just in the 1 year, we had 25 bills passed through the legislature and get signed by the governor. So quite a lot of bills. We have basically 3 focus areas in the office. The first focus area are things that I think of as being district specific. So issues that are some of the top pressing issues in our area. Housing is probably the #1 issue right now. Affordable housing, just access to housing that people can afford, whether or not it's subsidized housing, but people are increasingly feeling insecure, rent insecure, and of course we all see the growing number of homeless in our midst. And the homeless population is made up of a lot of seniors, a lot of senior women now, families, working poor, all kinds of people that we never saw on the streets before. So that's an issue that we work on. Traffic in the area, traffic congestion, and primarily traffic safety, which is such a huge challenge, and trying to make sure that we address our increasingly dangerous roads. And of course, wildfires, which I don't have to tell you, you know, is a huge concern and challenge, and probably going to increasingly be a real challenge for the state of California. Our second issue area are what we think of as vulnerable populations. These tend to be groups that don't make their way into Sacramento, they don't sponsor bills a lot, and yet they have real needs and often are the least able to get help. So foster youth, we were able to do a bill to help our foster youth access money for college, and closing a loophole that made a lot of kids have to move into homeless shelters just to go to college. We did a bill last year to help sex workers be able to report, and their customers report, violent crimes without having the fear of prosecution themselves, which was a huge barrier to getting people to come forward to report about violent sexual predators on the streets. And then, of course, trying to help children and families. Lastly, a big part of our work is protecting the environment, sustainability, and climate change, which is increasingly an existential threat to all of us. And we've done a lot of work successful in this area, and we'll continue to work in all 3 of these areas as we move into the next legislative session. So just drilling down a little bit more, in terms of traffic, I think we'll be talking a little bit about our Zero Vision bill, but it was AB 2363, which establishes for the first time a task force at the state level to look primarily at the relationship between how cities are forced to set speed limits and the impact that has on pedestrian and cyclist safety. Cities have tried to change this law over the years unsuccessfully, and finally we were able to get enough interest in this at the state level to say, we know what we have now isn't working, it was developed in the 1970s and we have to change it. AB 2955, we worked very closely with the city of Burbank and the city of Glendale and Los Angeles to make sure that cities had the tools they need in equestrian areas to cap speed limits and save speeds when we know that there are going to be horses present in the street. And particularly in areas where the drivers are going to places like highway on-ramps and cutting through to get to places that they work who may not even know that horses could be present with them in the road. And these are just some of the bills. Like I said, I'm not going through all of the bills. I'm just giving you, sort of cherry-picked bills. AB 1393, which was a bill that I was very passionate about, which we got through the legislature unanimously, only to have it vetoed by Governor Brown, and we may reintroduce it or a version of it. This is a bill that I thought was really common sense that says on the second conviction of reckless driving or street racing, and keep in mind, reckless driving is not, you roll a stop sign. Reckless driving is a serious misdemeanor where you've driven with a wanton disregard for public safety. So what this bill said was that on the second conviction for reckless driving or street racing, your car would be impounded for 30 days. We thought it was common sense. It was also the first time that the law would say that to get your vehicle back after that conviction for street racing, you would have to remove the illegal modifications. So the thing that makes your car go 300 miles an hour, or the racing harness, that you would have to remove that before you could get your car back. Well, it didn't. It got vetoed. Housing. We were successful with several housing bills this year. AB 3162 deals with sober living homes, and residential care facilities, which is something that's very important. And I do believe that we do need residential care homes, and the idea behind them is to get people in a normal residential neighborhood so that they can return to normality, to return to health in that kind of a setting. The problem is that this industry has been almost completely unregulated over the years, and there have been bad operators. And there have been complaints about bad operators and not a lot of ability of the state to crack down. So this bill did several things. One of the things that it does is now have a probationary period when a new facility opens, so that if they don't follow local zoning rules and if they do create a nuisance, they can have their license revoked within that period of time. Or they actually won't get licensed because of that. And the second thing that it does was what these residential care facilities were doing was they were buying up entire blocks. So they'd buy 4 houses on a block and turn them into de facto hospitals right in the middle of a residential neighborhood, stranding, a house in the middle of the block, and all of a sudden there's trucks, delivery trucks, and there's 50 people being served instead of what the law originally anticipated, which was 6 at a time. So we closed that loophole and made it not so much of an incentive for them to do that. And then AB 2263, which I think we're going to be discussing a little tonight, which does 2 things. It incentivizes historic preservation, which has been a passion of mine for many, many years, while at the same time incentivizing the reuse of historic buildings so that we give developers a reason to not tear those buildings down, but instead to reuse them, and we do that through parking concessions for them. Because those buildings, a lot of times they end up not being used because they don't conform to today's parking codes, but there are a lot of ways of overcoming that while preserving the building, and so that's what that bill does. Transportation, AB 2548, which I think we're going to be talking about, is a commuter benefits program to authorize LA Metro and LA County to establish a commuter benefit program for larger employers so that they can set money aside pre-tax out of their employees' pay that can then go back to them tax-free for them to use for metro passes, ride sharing, that kind of thing. Moving to other district-specific issues, wildfires. We did have a very large fire in the district last year. Luckily, we didn't have a lot of damage, but it was really, really scary. Out of that, we worked with CAL FIRE and some of our committees in Sacramento to introduce AB 2594, which protects wildfire victims by making sure that people have the full 2 years to begin the rebuilding process. Under current law, and sometimes they only had a year. And if you've had property that might be still unsafe, or you're trying to deal with your insurance company, that just wasn't enough time for homeowners to be able to rebuild. AB 2911 updates current fire safety measures. This bill updates a whole lot of things. It works with communities to make sure that their community plans really are fire resilient, and makes CAL FIRE have a much larger voice. So when a community says, you know what, we're going to do a subdivision in the hills and we're not going to have 2 ways to get in and out, CAL FIRE can say for the first time, no, you have to have safer ways to get people in and out of these communities. We look at how we do planting in those areas. We look at brush clearance. We have new mandates about clearing away from high power power lines, which can cause fire. Lots of different things that were really problematic in the last few fires. And AB 3098, one of the lessons that we learned in the fires last year was that some of our senior living facilities did not have adequate fire emergency procedures. They didn't know how they were going to evacuate people in an emergency. They didn't have vehicles. They didn't do drills to know who was going to be responsible for getting vulnerable seniors out. And in some cases, people were left behind. And it turned out okay. Nobody died, but it could have really been a disaster. So what we worked with the industry, and what this bill says is that they have to have evacuation plans that are adequate to get everybody out in an emergency, and that they have to do yearly drills to reinforce that with their staff. This is a bill that we're probably going to continue to expand on and make sure that all of our populations that are vulnerable and don't have the means to evacuate themselves are going to have something similar in place. Moving on to protecting vulnerable populations, I mentioned the college funding for foster youth, and I found out how important this was a few weeks ago when I was able to go and meet with a group of former foster youth, and a few of them had actually used this program already. In the past, foster youth couldn't use their housing dollars for college dorms, so they would have to either move into a homeless shelter or forego going to college. Really tragic. I mean, these are our children, and they go through so much and face so many obstacles that when foster youth get into college and really show that aptitude, it's really on us to support them. So this bill will do that. AB 1971 did not make it through the legislature, but we're committed to continuing working on this issue. This was a bill targeting our most vulnerable, most mentally ill homeless population. And what the bill attempted to do was to look at the people that are on the streets that because of their underlying mental illnesses are not capable of caring for their own serious health problems. And the care providers know who they are. I've gone to Skid Row, I've spent time with Essentia. They can point out people who are severely mentally ill on the streets, and they can say, that person there will be dead in 6 months because they have severe diabetes, or they have a heart condition, or whatever it is, and they are not able to get treatment for them because the law doesn't allow them to be compelled into treatment. We were trying to work with advocates on all sides to try to find the right balance to get help for those people, because allowing them to just die on the streets, I contend, is not humane. So trying to find a way to compel them into treatment and to compel that medical treatment while also respecting the choice that people do make to remain homeless. We weren't able to find that balance, but we're committed to continuing working on this, because there are people that you see who just really are just not capable of making that decision, and I just don't think it's humane to watch them suffer and die. At-risk family and kids. I was really proud to be able to pass AB 2802. This is a program that intercepts insurance payouts that go to people who owe back child support, and it takes that money from insurance payouts and diverts the back child support that's owed to their family, to their children. It's a program that's been very successful in other states, but it had not successfully passed the legislature in California. And in the states that have done this, they have been able to divert millions and millions and millions of dollars every year to kids who need it. So I really feel good to know that if someone gets this huge insurance payment and they owe back child support, those kids deserve their share of that. And because of this law, they'll get that now. We were co-author of AB 2413, which protects tenants who call 911 to make sure that they can call 911 and that's not used as a cause for eviction by unscrupulous landlords. Moving on to our last category, protecting the environment, and I'm not going to go deep into this bill because we're going to have a bit of a discussion about it. AB 3232 looks at the greenhouse gas emissions from our building sector. It used to be that power plants were our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, but because of California's clean energy requirements, that's now fallen somewhere between 2 and 3, with transportation being our biggest emitter, all of those trucks, all the cars, of greenhouse gases. But somewhere between the second and third largest emitter of greenhouse gases are buildings. And that's primarily space and water heating from natural gas in buildings. So we are taking that on. We took that on this year to look at finally regulating that, to moving to cleaner buildings. And that's what that bill does. AB 1414 puts a cap on solar permitting fees so that cities don't gouge you when you try to get solar panels. $350 should be plenty for a city to be able to permit a simple solar installation on a residential house. You shouldn't have to pay $1,500, $2,000 for that permit. So that caps the fee. And then AB 2975, Wild and Scenic Rivers. I think we're going to discuss that as well, but that protects California's wild and scenic rivers. And AB 1668, we have Metropolitan Water District to talk to us about that. That's a very big bill that we spent 2 years working on with lots and lots of advocates across the state and stakeholders. And this is a bill that tries to move California from the concept of water conservation to the concept of water efficiency. Because if we are truly efficient in how we use water, we have a lot more water to use in the places that we really want and need to use it. But that means us investing and our agencies investing in leak detection and in more efficient products for all of us. And we'll talk more about that bill. And then AB 1000, a bill that we were not able to get through the Senate, was a bill to protect the California, and this is a bill that Dianne Feinstein sponsored, that we worked on with her office very closely to protect the Mojave Desert against a water grab that's going on there that would drain water from some of our most ecologically sensitive areas in the state adjacent to the Mojave Preserve and other really important areas. Our goals for the next session are going to continue to be sustainability and climate change, because if you're not working on climate change, I think you're not really working in the right place. It's something that we all have to work on. Housing will continue to be a focus of our office. traffic safety, and access to health care. I was very honored to serve on the Select Committee on Universal Coverage. The committee worked on a package of, I think it was around 12 bills that would have gotten the state to pretty much 100% coverage for health insurance, affordable coverage. Unfortunately, most of the bills did not make it through the budgetary process. But we're going to continue to work on health care, because access to health care is another reason why people are suffering, why there are bankruptcies, and California's done a pretty good job, but there's still a lot of gaps. The bill that I carried would have helped make sure that middle-class people had coverage through Covered California that was affordable to them. And I thought it was a really common sense approach. And it was something that, you know, we should have done, but it wasn't funded, and we'll continue to try to work on that to make sure that everybody has access to high quality and affordable health care in California. So with that, we're going to invite up the panel, and I'm going to invite them up just in little groups. So this is our way of doing the Ellen DeGeneres show. So you can imagine I'm Ellen, and now we're going to bring, or Johnny Carson, or whoever you like. So for our first panel, we're going to invite up Michael Turner, who's the Deputy Executive Officer for LA Metro Government Relations. He's with Metro for 24 years, and I'm very grateful. We have this amazing, amazing panel, and I'm really grateful that they came out on a Thursday night before the holidays to join us. And Bradley Calvert, who recently started as the Assistant Director of Community Development at the City of Glendale. And before that, he worked in the city of Bellevue, Washington, and for MARTA, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority in Atlanta, Georgia. So thank you. Hello. And I don't know if I'm supposed to ask you questions a la Ellen, or if you're going to sing for us, or...
You don't want me to sing.
Okay. I think that you're going to just talk about some of the legislation and how it impacts the job that you do.
Sure. Well, we have at Metro are actually engaged in one of the largest expansion of a public transit system in the country right now. And that comes about from large support from the local voters who have supported funding initiatives in our area. We're also fortunate to have a significant infusion of funds through SB1, which the legislature passed a couple of years ago. So as a part of that, we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to try and encourage and incentivize people to be taking transit. And we're hopeful that in the future, there are a lot of different forms of transit that are available. We have our bus system, we have the train system, but we're also looking at things like microtransit, mobility on demand, where we're different kinds of transit services like sort of Uber and Lyft for transit, if you think of it that way. So in that regard, we looked at what other agencies, particularly in California, are doing to incentivize transit, and we looked at what's going on in the Bay Area, and quite frankly, we stole something from the Bay Area. The Bay Area has a commuter benefit ordinance where they work with employers to offer an incentive to their employees to take transit. And it's a fairly simple administrative maneuver or thing that the businesses have to do, where they just make a pre-tax option available to employees so that they can deduct the cost of taking transit from their pay, which is a tax saving for the employees, but the Bay Area has actually found that it's a tax reduction for the employers as well. So in order to do that, we need state legislation. We approached Assemblymember Friedman. She was gracious enough to carry the bill for us. The bill passed, the governor signed it, and we're now in the process of going through the implementation process, because we have to adopt an ordinance. If you can imagine, there's a significant amount of employers that we have to outreach to get them into this program. So we're taking some time to be proactive. We have to get an ordinance adopted by our board. We have to reach out to a significant number of businesses, start an education effort to get them involved in this program, and roll that out over the next couple of years. So,
great. Thank you. Bradley.
Yes, thank you. First, thank you for the invitation this evening. I'd also really like to applaud you for the work that you do. I've had the opportunity to work in pretty much every corner of the country at this point, and it is hard to get issues related to transportation and planning that are not only congestion-based recognized at the state level. So it's refreshing to see that. It's refreshing to see that work. Vision Zero is particularly important for myself and with the city of Glendale as a pedestrian, as a transit user, as a non-car owner. These are very important issues for me. Living in Glendale, we do have a high pedestrian and cyclist incident rate. And speaking of vulnerable populations, our best way to safeguard them is to regulate the movement of automobiles through our city. And a lot of that has to do with road design and speed. A way I like to compare it to, especially when you look at road design, is imagine a kid in a very long, wide hallway. If you drop them there, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to run full speed ahead and sprint. The way we design a lot of our streets, that's the way cars behave as well. The lanes are too wide, the right-of-ways are too wide, and it becomes a hostile environment for pedestrians and cyclists, but it's also encouraging unsafe behavior for drivers. And if we're going to really get people to use transit, how they're going to get there usually will be via bicycles and by foot. The safer we can make that for them, the more likely they are to use transit, the more likely we can create options. The commuter incentive program, I really support this as well. That is actually what got me to stop driving. When I lived in Atlanta, we had an incentive program there. I was offered a subway pass, and from that point on, I gave up my car and I stopped driving. I've also seen it work really well on a local level. Bellevue, Washington, where I worked before, it's a city not all that dissimilar from Glendale. It's about 150,000, 160,000 people. But this is a city that in their 9-block by 9-block downtown, they started with about 1,000 residents and about 15,000 jobs around 1992. By 2015, they had about 18 to 20,000 residents and they had about 50 to 60,000 jobs. Traffic volumes maintained the same between 1992 and 2015, and a lot of that was based on the fact that there was this incentive program. They offered options for transit passes, they offered van shares, they offered carpool services. So I've seen that work, and I think that is a great opportunity to really help reduce traffic congestion.
Great. Now I'm going to invite up Craig Bullock, who is Planning Director for LA Councilmember Mitch O'Farrell. He has 20 years of experience working in land use and development, and prior to working with Councilmember O'Farrell, Craig worked for the former Community Redevelopment Agency for the City of Los Angeles, where he administered the Business Attraction and Retention Program, reviewing affordable housing developments, and managing streetscape projects. And I believe he's going to talk about some of our housing bills.
Yes, thank you. So for those who might not be familiar with the City of Los Angeles, Council District 13 covers portions of Hollywood, Echo Park, Silver Lake, Atwater Village, and portions of Elysian Valley. And we have a lot of challenging housing that we need to construct our way to get affordable housing in our projects. And we need to, more importantly, create a system where we can build homeless housing. And we're very much working on bills that have been incentivized by the state, such as AB 2222, which allow developers to capitalize on density bonuses by the inclusion of affordable units within their developments. This council office doesn't support entitlements for a project unless they do affordable housing units, and we don't support entitlements that bypass those and the inclusion of affordable. We also work on the homeless housing, which has been a huge issue. We have issues of homelessness everywhere in the city, particularly in Hollywood. We're looking at the construction of what's called temporary bridge housing, and this is to house people while housing units are being constructed with bond money that was passed by the voters. We have hundreds of units of those coming online in the next, we hope, in the next 2 to 3 years. Great.
And AB 2263, which is our adaptive reuse ordinance, was modeled after a combination of LA City's current adaptive reuse ordinance and Glendale's adaptive reuse ordinance, and they've worked very well. In fact, the Sealy's building, some of you might be familiar with that, and also the Masonic Temple building in downtown Glendale, both probably couldn't have been reused if it wasn't for Glendale's ordinance that allowed for the parking requirements to be waived if the building was listed. So our bill spreads that statewide, and we had no opposition. No cities came and said they didn't want it. In fact, a lot of cities expressed support for the concept because they have been trying to figure out how to maintain those buildings that everybody loved in the community, but that didn't meet today's parking codes. So.
And it's amazing. I mean, giving a historic resource an economic life is what is going to preserve it. And that is so often missed. And the city of Los Angeles downtown did a really good job with that. And it's commendable to bring it statewide to present options to developers on that.
Great. Now I'm going to invite up Mike Young and Bill McDonald. Mike Young is a political and organizing director with the California League of Conservation Voters, CLCV, where he's worked since 2005. He currently serves on a number of boards of progressive organizations, including Black Women for Wellness Action Project, LA Forward, and West San Fernando Valley PALS. Bill McDonald is the manager of water efficiency for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. His team manages conservation programs for commercial, industrial, and residential customers, covering MWD's service area of 19 million people. Bill has more than 30 years of experience in water and energy efficiency. Welcome to both of you, and thank you again, all of you, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mike, I think you were going to talk about AB 3232 and about the Wild and Scenic Rivers legislation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of it for 3232, right? The need for zero emission buildings, and it's an interesting thing because when you think about what we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, a lot of times you think about the active stuff, right? It's like how drive a little bit less, get out of your cars. But the reality is, when you think about buildings, they do add up very, very quickly. Most of our buildings were built before or about 40% of our commercial buildings were built before 1978. There are a lot of new regulations that have come in, but you're talking about a lot of buildings that are still currently existing, and as we continue to build, they're still using a lot of the same archetypes. And so the reason a bill like this is so important is because imagine you're trying to reduce emissions, and yes, it's one thing when we can actively tell people, go turn off the light. But if your entire building is actually running off of new energy, like clean, renewable energy, and someone forgets to turn off the light, it didn't really matter if it wasn't run by coal or some other dirty energy. Like, we won't have to actively think about it. And there's, I think, this trap that we've spent so much time telling people, these things that you can do that you actively can think of, that's going to be the thing that ends up, reducing our carbon footprint and saving the planet. And yes, it helps. Like, every little thing helps. But it's also really helpful when you just do these big policies that make buildings cleaner, that make it easier so that people, even if they're not thinking about it, can actually help reduce their carbon footprint. It's really impressive.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I really like this format of bringing people up here who really impact with the bills, also when we work on legislation, we don't do it in a vacuum. We work with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different interest groups. And one of the nice things about AB 3232 was that we did work with the environmental community, and CLCV was, and Natural Resources Defense Council were really important in helping us get the bill passed. But we also had in support the Building Industry Association, who came forward and said, we can do this, that we already have the technology to build zero-emission buildings. A lot of our builders are already doing this, and we want to work with the state to develop building codes to just codify this, because there's no reason not to do it. Not only are the buildings not more difficult to build, but they're cleaner, they're cheaper to run sometimes, they're cleaner, people like being in them because they don't have the emission issue. Kind of like other green building codes, they're being embraced by the industry, but more slowly. And where we're going to have to do more work, of course, is figuring out how to retrofit existing buildings, because so much of our building stock is older. So how do we make those buildings more efficient so that the people who live in them have the benefits of having that more efficient building? So that's what this bill will be looking at over the next year, and really getting those codes modified to allow that to happen. But it was really great to see that coalition come together of groups that you think are going to be on opposite sides. But when I delivered the bill, I had the building industry sitting right there next to me saying, we want this legislation. This will be helpful to our members to have these codes looked at, and so that we have those guidelines so that we can all do what we need to do to reduce these emissions in the state and to set the standard for other states and other countries. And then, I don't know if you want to talk about Wild and Scenic Rivers, or I can if you like.
Oh, well, that one's actually, I think, well, I was going to say it was my favorite, but actually my favorite is your Cadiz bill. And you
can talk about that too.
Yeah, and you definitely know this. But there's a lot of, California has a lot of state and federal rivers, right? You're talking about over 2,100 miles of important riverways and streams. And as you can imagine, the current administration, the federal government, has not been the greatest friend to the environment and has been pretty reckless in terms of all of our natural resources. And they've been trying to do everything they can to revoke protections left and right. Well, one of the things that this bill does that's so valuable is that it says, okay, look, you might unprotect something federally, but we are in California, and the environment goes hand in hand with us. So we are going, if you do it, well, we've got their back. So like it doesn't, so you get state protection if you don't have federal protection. And I think that's incredibly important because there right now, especially in like I think the Merced River, there's an attempt to build and increase the Murdoch Reservoir. And one of the concerns there is that if you remove some of the protections, they're trying to build this reservoir, this big dam that could endanger, people are already having problems with because there are some endangered species that will be impacted by the construction of this dam. And so the hope is, you remove the protection and you can just do whatever you want there. First of all, there are all kinds of concerns about building dams. I think right now we're still a little weary about what happened with Oroville Dam. But the other concern is, well, just because the federal government took it off doesn't mean that what we were trying to protect wasn't important. And so this has California step in and say, no, the Trump administration might want to go one way, but California's values are a completely different way. And it's fantastic to be able to say that.
And you're welcome to talk about Cadiz if you want. That's AB 1000.
Yeah, that one's my favorite, like no doubt. So I know this is put into natural resource protection, but I also actually think about it in terms of protecting underserved communities and vulnerable populations. So there's been this project that's been ongoing for about 30 years now, right? Like Bill Clinton was president when they were still dealing with it. And essentially, the Cadiz Corporation is trying to privatize the water that's underneath the Mojave Desert. There are obviously all kinds of problems with this, not the least of which is to do so could create damage on some of our national parks and national monuments on its way over. Also, there's a question about why are you privatizing water under a desert? But the other big thing is that there's actually a native population that depends on that water, right? And it's insane to me that they have no say, practically. Well, the project had been rejected by the Obama administration, and then in this surprising move, I guess I say that ironically, the Trump administration has hired the lobbyist for the Cadiz project, who was the deputy Interior Secretary. He's on track to likely be the new Interior Secretary when Zinke goes out later this year. And so you have this guy who took this project that had been rejected, who'd been the lobbyist, is now coming back to say, okay, no, now I'm in charge, I'm going to go for this once again. And this bill basically says no, right? Like it does everything it can to stop this because this has been rejected over and over again, but they're like the little engine that could, but like an evil little engine that could, right? Like, I don't know, is there an evil equivalent? I guess it's this. So it's great to be able to say no, like you don't just get away with this. And we're really excited about the bill. We were really sad to see it get shut out in the Senate last year, but I think we're gonna try it again this year. And the fight is definitely not over. So,
thank you. And then lastly, love to hear MWD, who is really a great partner with the water legislation, on maybe demystifying it for folks a bit and explaining why you think it's important. And this is AB 1668.
It's not just important. This is, I've been doing water efficiency since the early 1980s. And this is, without a doubt, the most monumental water bill that's ever been passed. Prior to this, a lot of cities, including Metropolitan, which basically, if you're not familiar, Metropolitan is the water provider for Southern California. So about half the state's population, 19 million people. And with partners like cities of Glendale and Pasadena and Burbank and LA and all the cities that we serve, we've been doing a lot of water efficiency for decades. And we've driven down our gallons per person per day. And actually, when I moved out here in the 80s, From then till now, population in our service area has gone up about 6 million people, but our water demand has stayed steady. So that's why it took a while to get here. There's 6 million more people here, and that's why you have traffic folks up here on the panel. So there's a lot more people here, but as far as water use, we've stayed steady. But that's not enough. We've got to do more. And also what you find is some areas are doing a lot and other areas are not. And so what this bill does is it makes everybody have the same playing field and everybody have the same reporting. And what it will do is it will look at commercial and residential and landscape and set targets and standards and reporting requirements so everybody will be doing this equally. And that's why I say this is something that no other state's done. I work with Florida and Texas and Massachusetts and New York and all the other states, and this is definitely, without a doubt, the most leading piece of legislation that's ever come out of a state. And like most things that happen, people will start following this because of that. So we can't thank you enough for this. It doesn't mean that what we do ends. We still will be doing conservation and efficiency, but what will happen is it won't be just, there's a lot of pockets throughout the state and throughout our service area that haven't done a lot. And once all those people come on board, it'll be like a team. The entire team will work together and we'll really be able to drive the water efficiency bus a lot better.
Thank you. That's a great explanation of the goals of the bill. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is, unless any of you have anything else you want to mention, yes, go ahead.
You mentioned the population growth of 6 million people. There is a very interesting fun fact in that, which is that there have also been, with the growth of 6 million people, there's been a growth of 6 million cars that are owned in LA County alone. And that's a significant issue because we're looking at ridership on our system. And there are 6 million people. Well, that's not 6 million people that have moved into LA. That includes 6 million people that were born here and a variety of things that, but what's interesting is that there are 6 million more cars in LA County alone over I think it's like a 15-year period. That comes about for a variety of reasons, but it's impacting ridership. You know, if a car is cheap and people can get a car very cheaply now, they're going to choose to drive. And that, we think that's one of the factors that's impacting our ridership right now.
Yeah, in my personal experience, I work in downtown Los Angeles. I live in Chino Hills, which is, as folks at my work like to say, the 909. So I live in the 909. And if it wasn't for what folks are doing up here with mass transportation, I would work somewhere else. But because I can get on a train, fall asleep, wake up, and end up at Union Station, along with all my other coworkers and other folks here in Los Angeles, it just creates a vibrant economy. Without that type of mass transportation, you'd have to work really locally. And there are local jobs, but it really does help. And then one of the items that they were talking about up here on the panel is the company I work for does give us a stipend towards our monthly transit fee. So then that encourages more and more people to take the train. So there's very few people at my work. Why would you get in your car and drive to downtown Los Angeles when there's mass transportation and the firm you work for is giving you a stipend to help offset that? And with those type of things, we'll really be able to make a dent in our mass commuting and traffic.
Great. Anyone else? Great. I think we've hit on a lot of the big issues in the district. We've talked about transportation, we've talked about water, we've talked about climate change. So now I'd like to go and hear what you're all thinking. If you have questions about anything that you've heard, this is the time. We've got lots of folks here who can answer. I have my ledge director here as well. And if you have thoughts about anything that's happening or suggestions. And I will tell you that I can't see past the lights, so if I don't exactly know who's talking, forgive me.
Hi, Laura. This is Ben.
Hi, Ben.
Question about the commuter benefit that you were talking about. How does that work with the federal commuter benefit? Is it on top of it? Does it supplement? How does that balance out?
No, the tax bill just makes, there's a federal tax code that authorizes it, so that just makes it available. That doesn't mean people do it. And so we're going to adopt an ordinance that would require businesses to make it available to employers. Right.
Yeah, if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Seamus. Laura, thanks so much for doing this. I have a question for you, and also I think for Craig and maybe some of the other panelists. I'd love to hear a little bit more, given the fight on Prop 10 and on SB 827, about where you think this dividing line in the housing crisis falls between state and local control. And that's obviously something that's run through a lot of these debates. So how do you see that playing out in the next session?
Oh, that's such a great question, and we could have an entire town hall. In fact, we did have an entire town hall on housing. For those of you who don't follow our town halls, we did we did two town halls that were sort of twin town halls. We did one on transportation and one on housing, because in my mind, they're linked. So yeah, this was the story of the last year, which was we have this housing crisis. We're a couple million units short in the state of California. In other words, we have about 2 million at least. I think it's a 2 or 3. Does anyone know? I think it's around 2 million more people or more families that need a roof over their heads than we have those roofs over heads. So, of course, we have this crisis. And it's not a manufactured crisis like some people think. There are not 2 million vacant units across the state of California. We have not kept up with the population growth. We talked about those 6 million people coming to our region alone. We have not built 6 million units in Los Angeles for those people. So what happens is we have several families sometimes living in one unit. We have people being forced out. We have a buyer's market, a seller's market in terms of what landlords can rent for, because there's such a huge demand for housing that they can raise the rents. So it's basically the perfect storm of increasing demand, and at the same time, a lot of cities have made it harder and harder to build over the years. And when you look at the zoning maps, and the planner can attest to this, when you look at the zoning maps in Los Angeles, for instance, you'll see a trend going back 100 years or 80 years from no zoning, build whatever you want, to more and more restrictive zoning over time. Constant cycle of about every 10 years, new general plans being done in communities and cities, Glendale included, where they downzone areas and say, we're going to make it so you can build less and make it more and more restrictive. And that's at the same time when you have more and more people moving. So the schism you're talking about and that tension between the local and the state is that zoning has traditionally been under the purview of local governments. And local governments say, we're closest to our communities, we should decide about land use. It really should be up to us to decide how we're going to grow and how much growth. That makes a lot of sense. And then you have the state on the other side saying, but we now have a statewide crisis. We have a housing crisis not just in Los Angeles, not just in Glendale, but we have it in Fresno, we have it in farm communities, we have it in the Bay Area, we have it all across the state. So we have a statewide crisis. And so when there's a statewide issue, it's up to the state to act. Plus having this history of the cities not always doing a great job of accounting for the population growth. So that's that tension. And it's playing out. It played out last year with some of the bills, and it'll continue to play out going into next year with more legislation. I did sit down with some of the board members from the LA League of Cities, as well as our own mayor, Emily Luddy in Burbank, to talk about ways that we can work more collaboratively so that it's not just the state cracking down on the cities, but are the cities willing to come to the table and take ownership of some of this? And so I think that there is an attempt from the cities to say, Wilson, we know there's a problem, we're willing to be part of the solution, but it can't just be that the rich cities don't have to build anything, and the sort of the poorer or more mixed cities are the ones that have to get the brunt of taking care of that housing. And unfortunately, when left to their own devices, that's what's been happening across California. And that's where the state starts to look and say, well, wait a minute, if these really wealthy cities aren't building anything, and then you've got other cities who are, building, a lot of times in the lower income areas, which causes its own issues sometimes, maybe we need to come in and kind of navigate this a little. So I think that tension's going to continue. I can't tell you, I know what that balance should look like exactly. I hope to keep working with our local representatives, with League of Cities, to try to find, solutions together. And we'll see. We'll see how it goes. That's kind of a long answer. And if you're really interested in how we got where we are now and what goes into all of this, all of our town halls are on our website, and we do have that town hall on housing, which is really fascinating. And in addition, I'm on a select committee on housing for the middle class. Because we're building some affordable housing, and then of course there's luxury housing, but who's building, why aren't we building for that middle anymore? And so we had a really fascinating discussion in Sacramento a few months ago where we had a bunch of developers come in and go through their pro formas and show us why when they build, they end up having to rent or sell at the prices they do. And there's another hearing coming up, I think, in 2 weeks in San Diego that I'm going to try to attend, but it's in San Diego, so I don't know if I'll be able to get down there. But those are also available on the internet to watch.
Okay, again, thank you for having this town hall and the back and forth. I think it's really good. And two-part question, I guess it leads into what you were talking about, the affordable housing and where we can get more information, either prior town halls or a contact in your office to delve into some of these things. Because here's one of the things we see are coming up with the density bonus. You may have apartments or a multifamily, say 15 units, larger apartments, older apartments that were, say, 800 or 2-bedroom units. And those are being torn down, and they're building very high-density micro units. So they're basically cramming a lot of units, getting the density bonus, and building these very dense mixed use or just multifamily. It's kind of taking it away from, as you said, the family affordable or middle income to making it very expensive.
Absolutely, and I personally don't like to see housing removed to create new housing. It causes displacement. Sometimes those old buildings are charming. They offer sometimes bigger units, like you said. Sometimes, if you tear down a really nasty 1970s building, that's okay in my mind. Sometimes it's appropriate, but a lot of times it is problematic. And one of the issues is that because of that restrictive zoning, sometimes developers only have that option in terms of building density, because everything else is either been made to where it's lower density, so they can't build an apartment building, or it's commercial and they don't allow housing there, or for whatever reason, the amount of land that's available to build is restricted. And when we had our town hall, we had a professor from UCLA who came and showed us those maps, and the amount of places where you can actually build high density or even medium density housing is surprisingly small across Los Angeles. And we're in a city where we have so much land. And then there's also disincentives with Prop 13 and other things that make it sometimes to where it's more expensive for the property owner to increase that use because of maybe they're paying taxes on a building from the 1970s or 1960s. All of a sudden you tear it down and build something else and their tax rate jumps up. So it's like, I might say, well, God, having that donut shop, that can't be making anyone any money. But when you realize they're paying, $700 a year in taxes on it, the economics of it start to look a little different. So there's all kinds of reasons that are overcomable of creating more places to build those units so they don't have to constantly move into the existing multifamily areas to do it. But we haven't freed up enough of that land. That's what I think. There's so many places. I look at, in my district, and I'm just gonna pick on 2 streets, and forgive me if you love these streets, but when I think about streets that I wanna walk down or live on, I'm not thinking Vermont in the middle of Hollywood or Western in the middle of Hollywood. It's literally like a donut shop next to a mattress shop with a parking lot. Like, they're very unattractive, they're very underutilized. Imagine if you had 6-story buildings with apartments above and maybe the same donut shop and mattress shop in the bottom now. Like, that makes sense, and you could do that there without displacing anyone because there's no housing, very little housing on those stretches, but something's happening in the market that's making it to where they're not building there. And my guess is the zoning doesn't allow it because it might be 2 stories. So Los Angeles is trying to update their community plans to change some of this. But they're having a really hard time, for a variety of reasons, having to do with lawsuits and, all kinds of stuff. So we're trying to help them. We've actually been in contact with some of the council offices and Hollywood Chamber to help speed that along. Because I agree, we're not building in the places that would really enhance our quality of life always in Los Angeles. And doing it in a way where you can kind of do that more mid-density as opposed to that super high density. And we've done density badly in LA. We've built a 300-unit building not within walkable or walkable distance of anything, in the middle of nowhere, and then another one somewhere else, rather than creating neighborhoods that are medium or high density neighborhoods. So, and so of course people say, well, I don't want that near me. It doesn't fit into the neighborhood. But we should be creating areas where it's enhancing it. And I'll just say one last thing. I live part of the year now in Midtown in Sacramento. And there's a great poster child for having that density where you have a Victorian house next to a 1950s 8-plex, next to a new 6-story higher density building, and it all works, and it's so walkable. I live 1.5 miles from the Capitol building, and I look forward to my walk every morning and every evening, because I walk past little shops and restaurants and places where I can go and, spend money on things as I walk, or buy a cup of coffee, or, and have experiences and be social. We don't have enough of that in Los Angeles. So we have places where we could create that and add a lot of housing, but we have to help it. Does anyone want to talk about zoning issues in LA or?
I agree, though. I go to Sacramento a lot, and it's amazing that these beautiful Victorian homes, and then right beside it is a bakery, and then something different, and then another home, and it's just very, I don't know, it all fits, it all blends, it all works, and I don't know what they did or how they zoned it, but it all fits in together, and it really makes for a, because it's not like you walk down the street and go, okay, I gotta walk 15 blocks before there's something, or it's going to be this next 10 blocks is all industrial. It's all kind of mixed in, and it all kind of works.
Yep.
And we're actually looking at our downtown specific plan, and for a lot of the issues described there, right, we're getting a lot of high density growth. It's mainly small units. It's not the missing middle element, if you will. And we're looking at how do we improve those standards to encourage, even in high density situations, to incorporate that missing middle. A reference I always like to make of the high rises in Vancouver, British Columbia is they're either wrapped in coffee shops and donut shops, or they're wrapped in townhomes. And having that alternative option, especially at the street level, is so important. If you walk the streets of Vancouver, it's amazing how many kids you see, the life and the energy at that street level, because it does have that diversity of units. But it's very important, though, that we are losing these smaller ones that are that missing middle, that are affordable, and they're being replaced for the higher end luxury units. And how do we try to work with that? And right now we're looking at incentive programs as part of that revamp of the DSP to try to encourage more of that growth.
Well, today we actually released the environmental impact report for the Hollywood Community Plan. And the last Hollywood Community Plan was invalidated by the courts. So we're literally operating off a 1988 community plan, which is really challenging because every time you want to do something, it's like you're going back decades to see how it was done then. So we're very hopeful. We appreciate the support that we've received from the state as far as to protect community plans. And we're actually, from a development standpoint in Hollywood, a more urban environment, we're very fortunate to have metro stops. And we're seeing a lot of higher density projects come through. And other portions of the district, we're seeing newer developments on either vacant properties, economically obsolete ones, and the restoration of actually some of the charming ones that we actually want to retain. It's a really hard balance to keep up with, and especially on the affordable component. But we're very fortunate that we've been able to preserve a lot of the rent stabilized ordinance units that we have.
And I would just say that if you keep an eye on housing issues over decades in this county, housing issues become transportation problems. If you remember, people moved up to the North County. That created a transportation problem. People moved out to the 909 and created a different transportation problem. And so housing is also a transportation problem. We have obviously issues with homeless people on our system, and it's a service issue, it's a quality of service issue, but it's a public health issue, and it's a human problem. We have created teams, we work with the county, with social service providers. So, we're not just gonna go out and arrest homeless people on our system. We go out and we have teams of people, and we have found ways to interact with the homeless population to get them into services, but it's a problem that impacts transportation. So we would add our voice to try and do something about the housing issue. You mentioned Hollywood. Hollywood had a big resurgence after the subway went in. I remember one of my first jobs at Metro was public affairs on the subway construction. I remember what Hollywood was like before the subway went in, and it's a big change. We've been working with cities as we plan our lines. We're trying to work with cities to incentivize planning around our stations so that we can do more smart planning, encourage density around our transit stations, but density works within different communities. And if you go along our system, you'll see different kinds of projects around, from Hollywood, where we have very dense kinds of developments, to South Pasadena, where there's less dense developments, but density that works in that neighborhood. We're looking at rail lines throughout the county and how we can work with cities to do smart planning around the future stations.
And I would really like to echo some of that. I mean, that it's so important, the housing and the transportation issue, and thank you for understanding that, to go kind of plannerese on it. We always like to refer to location affordability, because it doesn't matter how many affordable units we build. If we put them all the way out in Palmdale, it doesn't matter. That person is saddled with the expense of a car. They can't get on Metro. They're using tons of gasoline, their car maintenance. Any affordability they might have achieved with that housing that far out, it doesn't mean anything at that point. So being able to locate it around transit is absolutely essential. And looking at that connection, that nexus between both the transportation cost and the housing cost.
I think I saw another hand.
Is high-speed rail going to happen in the next few years?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it.
Is high-speed rail going to happen in the next few years?
Oh my goodness. I wouldn't be, I don't know. I don't think I would take a bet on that either way, especially if it happened.
I would take a bet of no.
Definitely not the next few years. The question is, will it happen ever? And I'm not sure. In our lifetime? What do you think? What do you got? I could be Ellen. All right, panel. I'd like a answer from everybody. What do you think? Is it going to happen, and if so, when? And where?
The Padres will be in the World Series before this happens, I think.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not. So I should note, our organization supported it, and I tried to follow it, but the likelihood of it passing is really slim. I mean, I think there'll be parts of it that are constructed, but in terms of it actually building across the state, there's just so many stumbling blocks and so much resistance to it that I'm not sure. I mean, when you say lifetime, I think I'm the youngest person on the panel.
Well, don't be looking at me.
Maybe, I don't know. And I'm like, I'm not sure I'll see it in my lifetime, right? Like, I think it's a worthwhile project in a lot of ways that I think don't get talked about, but it's also a project that I just see so many barriers to it being done, and it's just so slow because there's so many lawsuits that keep happening to it.
I would concur with that.
I think it's going to be very difficult to do that without a lot of federal support to either help push it through or help pay for it. And so I would say come back and ask again after 2020 or 2024 at this point.
I would say that specific high-speed rail project is not coming anytime soon. I'd say there's a funding issue that you have to look at with the project overall in the state, which could become a state budget issue. But then I would say look at some of the rail systems that exist right now, and can we use some of the resources in the state to make those rail systems go faster. You mentioned the Metrolink system that serves Southern California. There's also an Amtrak line that goes from San Diego all the way up to San Luis Obispo that could be a higher speed train than the Amtrak train runs right now. It's a great train service. You can get down to San Diego in a couple hours, but the problem is, and I took it a couple months ago, and what the train was late, you know, if that train's late by 5 or 10 minutes, it totally messes up the schedule and it becomes a horrible ride because you have freight trains on it, Metrolink trains on it, you have all these problems. You put a little bit of money compared to what the high-speed rail is going to cost. You put a little bit of money in a service like that, you can make significant improvements to a Southern California rail system that would have a lot of benefits a lot sooner.
Yeah, that would be a great idea. I mean, you can get to San Diego now on a train, but it takes a while, and if you could get down there quicker and cheaper and easier, San Diego's a great place to, if you could get down there, do stuff, and come home in the same day. Now it's like it's a weekend trip to take a train down there. And it shouldn't be. It's not that far where you have to do it over a weekend.
So I have no insider information, but I'm going to bet that somebody does a public-private partnership to do high-speed rail from LA to Vegas before we do the LA route, because that's something that you could fill like all night long, literally.
So
if you could get to Vegas in an hour on a train, can you imagine?
There was actually something called Desert Express.
It's already permitted.
Yeah, I've heard people have talked about it, but I don't think anybody's. Did somebody come and actually promise to fund it recently or something?
Well, they haven't identified the funding, but there was a consortium called Desert Express that had some kind, I'm not clear on all the details, but they had some kind of rights on a Victorville to Vegas train. There is a new group now that is looking at that, and they want to go to Victorville. It's a challenge to get from Victorville down into the rest of Southern California. If you go through where the 15 and the 215 goes, you have a mountain range and steep grades, but they're looking at, can they go over to Palmdale? Because there's the Metrolink connection up to Palmdale. So can they make the route that way? And would that be a good investment for creating high-speed rail?
We're going to take our last question now.
I don't think I need the mic. Thank you. I've got 4 comments. Number 1, to the Metro guy, you have a huge problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We do have a problem with homelessness on our system. And you are absolutely right. It is a problem. I would suggest that it's not just a police problem. Because quite frankly, if somebody pays a fare and gets on our train, they have a right to be on our train. And we cannot kick them off. That's why we've tried to take... Yeah. And you're referring to downtown specifically? Okay, I actually sit down the hall right next to the person that manages our entire security program. I'll talk to him about that. But you are right. There is a serious homelessness problem on our system. And I will talk to the head of our security about what's going on in downtown LA. I was actually taking the train yesterday and something happened on our system. There was an incident at Pershing Square. I actually don't want to know. I think I know what the problem was. But there was a problem at the Pershing Square station. And so I see it very often because I'm riding that train. But I will talk specifically to the head of our security about what's going on in downtown. About the HOV system, this is something that we've actually been looking at because there are, in the Bay Area, they have the HOV lanes are, they're HOV lanes only during the peak period. And we've looked at that in Los Angeles County. On the 14, there was actually separate legislation that authorized those lanes to be HOV lanes during the off-peak period. There was actually an attempt to change the occupancy limit on the 10 decades ago, or maybe not decades ago, but a long time ago, and it created horrible congestion because we had there were a lot more cars that used the lanes. We actually work with all of the agencies in Southern California because when you look at the HOV system, you can't just look at just the lanes in LA County. We have to look at all of the lanes in Southern California. So we're looking at ways we can maximize the efficiency of the HOV system. Peak hour restrictions or opening them up during the off-peak is one thing we're looking at. We're also looking at the enforcement on the lanes because there's a lot of people that cheat on the HOV lanes. So there's an enforcement problem in the HOV lanes. If you recall, the clean fuel vehicles were allowed into the HOV lanes. We think that's actually not one of the reasons that the lanes are congested. The percentage of clean fuel vehicles that's in the HOV lanes is relatively small compared to the overall number of vehicles that are in the lanes. But we are looking at the efficiency of the HOV lanes overall because most of the HOV lanes in Los Angeles County are at their capacity. And so we're going to have to do something about them.
Thank you. So, okay, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank our panel. I really, really appreciate your coming out and helping us tonight.
Thank you for the
and
invitation.
thanks all of you for being here.